Christmas Eve, 1967, and 9-year-old Michael Jackson stood frozen at the window of 2300 Jackson Street, Gary, Indiana. His house was the only dark one on the entire block. Wait, what happened in the next 3 seconds wouldn't just change one night. It would set in motion the escape from Gary that the entire world would one day witness, but nobody saw it start here, in this moment, at this window, with a child's hands pressed against freezing glass. The neighborhood outside glowed like something from a dream Michael had never been allowed to have. Red lights wrapped around porch railings. Blue icicles dripped from gutters. White stars blinked in windows. Every house on Jackson Street looked warm, looked full, looked like the families inside were celebrating something bigger than themselves. Every house except the Jacksons. Their windows stayed dark. Their porch stayed bare. Katherine had explained it again this morning, patient as always, her voice soft over the sound of Jackie and Tito arguing about whose turn it was to practice first. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. Christmas was a pagan holiday. God didn't want them celebrating the birth of Christ with material things, with decorated trees, with the kind of lights Michael was staring at right now through glass, so cold it hurt his fingertips. But knowing the reason didn't make it easier. Michael had been standing at this window for 7 minutes, watching Mr. Henderson across the street carry boxes inside, watching the Williams kids 2 doors down press their faces against their own window to look at their tree. 7 minutes of watching everyone else have what he couldn't name but desperately wanted. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it away with his sleeve. The fabric was thin. His mother had patched the elbow twice already. In Gary, in 1967, in a 2-bedroom house with 7 children, thin sleeves got patched until there was nothing left to patch. Behind him, the house was chaos in the comfortable way families learn to manage. Jermaine was drilling the bass line to their newest song, the one Joseph said would get them noticed at the next talent show. Marlon was complaining about being hungry again. Jackie was trying to explain something about school to Tito, who wasn't listening. Katherine moved through it all like water, her presence settling arguments before they escalated, her hands always busy with something that kept the household running. Joseph wasn't home yet. His shift at the steel mill didn't end until 7. When he got home, there would be practice. 3 hours, minimum. Joseph didn't care that other kids got Christmas Eve off. Success didn't take holidays. Notice something about that window. The way Michael's reflection looked back at him, small and serious, while behind the reflection the neighborhood celebrated. He was seeing 2 worlds at once, the one he was in and the one just beyond reach. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in. Joseph Jackson stepped through, still wearing his work clothes, the smell of the mill clinging to him, metal and oil, and the particular exhaustion of 12-hour shifts. He didn't say hello. He never did. He scanned the room with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to assess situations quickly, looking for problems before they became disasters. His eyes found Michael at the window. Boy, get away from there. Michael didn't move. Couldn't, maybe. His hands stayed pressed against the glass. Just 5 more seconds. Just 5 more seconds of imagining what it would feel like to have those lights, that warmth, that sense of belonging to something celebrated instead of separated. Michael. The voice was sharper now. Michael's hands dropped. He turned. Joseph stood in the middle of the small living room, still in his coat, still carrying the weight of the day in his shoulders. Around them, the other boys had gone quiet. This was the thing about Joseph. He didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. His presence did it. The expectation in his eyes did it. The knowledge that disappointment from Joseph Jackson was worse than anger did it. What were you doing at that window? Michael's throat felt tight. Looking. At what? The lights. Joseph's jaw worked. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Then he crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled the curtain shut. The neighborhood disappeared. The living room got darker. We don't celebrate Christmas. You know that. Your mother explained it. I explained it. Why are you looking at things that aren't for us? Michael wanted to say that he wasn't looking because he wanted Christmas. He was looking because everyone else had it, and he wanted to understand why they got to feel something he didn't. He wanted to say that it wasn't about the holiday. It was about being different, being the only dark house, being the kid who couldn't talk about Santa Claus at school without other kids looking at him like something was wrong with his family. But 9-year-old boys in Gary, Indiana, in 1967, didn't explain their feelings to fathers like Joseph Jackson. They nodded. They said, "Yes, sir." They moved on. Michael nodded. Joseph studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to the other boys. "We're practicing in 15 minutes. Michael, you're starting with I Feel Good. If you can't get your head out of that window and into the music, we'll run it until you can." He walked past Michael toward the kitchen, where Katherine was heating something that smelled like beans and cornbread. The curtain stayed closed. Michael stayed standing in the middle of the room, his brothers slowly returning to whatever they'd been doing before Joseph arrived. Nobody mentioned the window. Nobody mentioned Christmas. In the Jackson household, you moved forward. You didn't dwell. But here's what nobody saw. Remember this, because it matters later. Michael walked to the small bedroom he shared with his brothers. All 5 of them were crammed into bunk beds and floor space that never felt like enough. He sat on the edge of the bottom bunk. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but would. Years later, when people interviewed him about his childhood and he talked about feeling different, feeling separated, feeling like the world was celebrating something he could only watch through glass. He reached under the mattress and pulled out a piece of paper. He'd been drawing on it for weeks, using a pencil Tito had stolen from school. The drawing was rough, childish, the kind of thing 9-year-olds make when they're trying to capture something bigger than their skill allows. It showed a house, not 2300 Jackson Street, a different house, bigger, with windows that had curtains that stayed open, with a yard that had space, with rooms where brothers didn't have to share beds. And in the window of this imaginary house, drawn with careful shaking lines, was a Christmas tree. Michael stared at the drawing. Then he folded it. Then he folded it. And he folded it. Then he walked to the small trash can by the door and dropped it inside. This is the moment. This is where it starts. Not at Motown. Not at the Apollo. Not in any of the stories you've heard about how Michael Jackson became Michael Jackson. It starts here, with a 9-year-old boy throwing away a dream of Christmas because the real dream was bigger than holiday lights. The one that mattered. The real dream was getting out of Gary. Stop for a second and picture the bedroom. 5 boys, 1 small space, walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing, ceiling low enough that Tito had to duck when he stood up from the top bunk. This was where the Jackson 5 practiced when it was too cold to go to the garage. This was where they planned their harmonies. This was where they fought over who got to sleep closest to the radiator. This was where Michael had spent hours staring at that ceiling, hearing his brothers breathe in their sleep, wondering if there was something beyond this room, this house, this street, this city of steel mills and dark windows. Practice started exactly when Joseph said it would. 15 minutes. The boys gathered in the living room. Katherine moved the furniture against the walls to make space. Joseph stood in the corner with his arms crossed, watching. He didn't play an instrument. He didn't sing. He directed. He criticized. He demanded perfection from children who were learning what perfection meant. From the top, Joseph said, "Michael, you're flat on the second verse. Jackie, you're rushing the bridge. Jermaine, watch Michael's cues. Tito, Marlon, tighter on the harmonies. We're performing at the Roosevelt High Talent Show in 3 weeks. If you sound like this, we're not winning." They ran through I Feel Good 5 times before Joseph was satisfied with the intro. Then they started on My Girl. Then Please Mr. Postman. Each song got dissected. Each mistake got corrected. Joseph's voice cut through the music like a blade, precise and unforgiving. Katherine brought water between songs. She caught Michael's eye once, offered a small smile that said what she couldn't. "You're doing fine. Keep going. Your father sees something in you that he doesn't know how to say, except through this." Listen carefully to what happened at 8:43 that night. They were working on a new song Joseph had brought home from the mill, something one of the other workers had been humming that Joseph thought had potential. Michael was in the middle of the chorus when his voice cracked. Just slightly, just enough. Joseph's hand went up. The music stopped. Again, Michael started over. His voice cracked in the same spot. Again. 7 times. 7 times Michael sang that chorus. 7 times his voice betrayed him, breaking at the exact moment it needed to stay strong. By the 7th attempt, his throat felt raw. His eyes were burning. He wanted to stop. He wanted to run back to that window, throw open the curtain, and scream at the neighborhood that he didn't care about their lights, their trees, their celebrations, because he had something they didn't. A father who believed he could be great, even if the belief looked like cruelty, even if it felt like punishment, even if it meant Christmas Eve 1967 was spent in a living room with no decorations, running through songs until his voice gave out. But he didn't run. He sang it again. The 8th time his voice held, Joseph nodded. They moved on. Practice ended at 11:17. The boys filed into the bedroom without talking. This was normal. After hours of Joseph's corrections, nobody felt like conversation. They knew the drill: sleep. Tomorrow would be Christmas for everyone else. For them, it would be another day of practice, another day of getting ready for the next competition, the next chance to prove they belonged somewhere bigger than Gary. Michael lay in the bottom bunk, staring at the slats of wood 2 feet above his head. Marlon was already snoring. Jermaine was muttering something in his sleep about bass lines. Jackie and Tito were whispering about a girl from school, their voices low enough that Joseph wouldn't hear from the other room. Michael listened to all of it. The sounds of his brothers, the sounds of their tiny house, the sounds of Gary settling into Christmas morning. At 11:42, he heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the house. Michael lifted his head just enough to see through the crack in the bedroom door. Joseph was standing at the living room window. The curtain was open again. He was looking at the same lights Michael had looked at hours earlier. From where Michael lay, he could see his father's profile, the hard line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped behind his back like he was physically holding himself together. Joseph Jackson stood at that window for 7 minutes, the same amount of time Michael had stood there, looking at the same houses, seeing the same lights, maybe thinking the same things. That this neighborhood, this life, this version of success that peaked at a steel mill job and a mortgaged house in Gary wasn't enough, that there had to be something more, that these boys he was drilling, these boys he was pushing, these boys who sometimes looked at him with fear instead of love, were the way out. When Joseph finally turned away from the window, Michael saw something on his father's face that he'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, something that looked almost like sadness. Like Joseph was standing at that window seeing the same thing Michael had seen, 2 worlds, the one they were in and the one just beyond reach. Joseph closed the curtain. He walked back toward the bedroom he shared with Katherine. He never knew Michael was watching, never knew his son had seen him at the window, had seen the crack in the armor, had understood in that moment that maybe Joseph's hardness wasn't about cruelty. Maybe it was about fear. Fear that if he wasn't hard enough, if he didn't push hard enough, these boys would end up like him, working 12-hour shifts, coming home exhausted, standing at windows on Christmas Eve, wondering if life could have been different. Michael lay back down. He stared at the ceiling, and he made a decision that he was too young to articulate, but old enough to feel he would get out of Gary. He would get out for all of them. For Katherine, who deserved rooms that weren't crowded. For his brothers, who deserved beds that weren't shared. For Joseph, who deserved to stand at windows and see something he'd built instead of something he was locked out of. The next morning was December 25th, 1967, Christmas morning in Gary, Indiana. While the neighbors opened presents, the Jackson boys ran through their set list. While families gathered around trees, the Jacksons gathered around Joseph's expectations. While the rest of Jackson Street celebrated, 2,300 Jackson Street prepared. 18 months later, in July 1969, the Jackson Five would sign with Motown Records. They would leave Gary. They would move to Los Angeles. They would release their first single, and it would go to #1. Their house would have more than 2 bedrooms. Their windows would have whatever decorations they wanted. They would become the first group in history to have their first 4 singles hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. But it started here, in this house, on this street, on this Christmas Eve, when a 9-year-old boy chose ambition over resentment, chose his father's dream over his own confusion, chose getting out over fitting in. Remember one more thing before we go. In 1993, when Michael Jackson accepted the Grammy Legend Award, he said something that confused people who didn't understand his childhood. My childhood was taken away from me. There was no Christmas. There were no birthdays. People heard bitterness. But if you'd been at that window on Christmas Eve 1967, if you'd seen what Michael saw, both in the neighborhood and in his father's face, you'd understand it wasn't bitterness. It was acknowledgement. The price was paid early. The sacrifice was made at 9 years old, at a window, watching lights he'd never have because he was chasing something bigger. That night in Gary, Michael Jackson didn't get Christmas. But 18 months later, he gave it to his whole family in a way those neighbors with their lights and trees never could. He got them out. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps, more than you'd think. And if you want to know what really happened at that Motown audition in Detroit, the moment Berry Gordy saw something in Michael's eyes that made him sign 5 kids from Gary he'd never heard of, tell me in the comments, because what Joseph saw at that window, Berry Gordy saw it too, and it changed everything.